The fog over the Blackwood River did not roll in like weather. It rose from the water like a phantom, a white, suffocating breath that erased the world. It was 5 a.m, the hour of the wolf, when the boundary between the living and the lost is thinnest. On the marshy eastern bank, the air smelled of wet cedar, decaying leaves, and the deep, mineral tang of silt. Lyra stood in the open doorway of her workshop, a mug of black coffee warming her calloused hands. At 28, she had become as much a part of this landscape as the cypress knees jutting out of the mud. She was a restorer of things the water had tried to destroy, old skiffs, rotting hulls, fractured oars. The town of Blackwood, sitting high and dry on the opposite cliff, called her the River Witch when they thought she wasn't listening. They whispered that a woman living alone in the floodplain, fixing broken boats, must be broken herself. They weren't wrong. Lyra walked back to her workbench. A 60-year-old wooden canoe lay upside down on the sawhorses. She picked up a block of sandpaper and began to work on the hull. Shoo-shh-h-h. Shoo-shh-h-h. The sound was rhythmic, a meditation that kept her thoughts from drifting to the empty chair in her kitchen or the letters she kept in a shoebox beneath her bed. Letters she had never mailed. She preferred the company of wood to people. Wood was honest. If wood was rotten, it crumbled. It didn't smile at you while holding a knife behind its back. We try to bury the truth in deep water, forgetting that the river eventually brings everything back to the surface. She stopped sanding. A sound had cut through the rhythm. It wasn't the splash of a gar or the call of a heron. It was a heavy, dull thud, the sound of dead weight hitting the mud. Lyra froze. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She set the sandpaper down and grabbed the heavy iron flashlight she kept by the door. She stepped out into the mist, the cold dampness instantly soaking through her flannel shirt. "Hello!" she called out. Her voice was swallowed by the fog, deadened instantly. She walked toward the riverbank, her boots sinking into the soft earth. The mist swirled around her knees, obscuring the ground. She swept the beam of the flashlight back and forth, slicing through the white void. Then she saw it. It was a shape that didn't belong to the river. It wasn't a log, and it wasn't a boat. It was the crumpled architecture of a man, lying face down in the reeds, half submerged in the icy water. Lyra didn't scream. She ran. She splashed into the shallows, the freezing water biting at her ankles. She grabbed the man by the shoulders of his coat, heavy, sodden wool that felt expensive to the touch. With a strength born of years hauling timber, she pulled. He was heavy, dead weight, but she dragged him onto the muddy bank, rolling him onto his back. The beam of the flashlight fell across his face. Lyra stopped breathing. She knew this face. Everyone in the state knew this face. It was on billboards, on television screens, on the front page of the newspapers that lined her birdcage. Bennett Caldwell, the Golden Son, the heir apparent to the Caldwell political dynasty, the man who had been reported missing 3 days ago, sparking a statewide manhunt. But he didn't look like a senator now. He looked like a ruin. His skin was the color of marble, pale and waxy. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead with river muck. There was a nasty gash above his right eyebrow, bleeding sluggishly, the red dark and stark against his pale skin. He wasn't moving. "Breathe," Lyra commanded, pressing her hands against his chest. "Come on, breathe." She felt the cold seeping from his body into hers. She leaned down, checking for air, panic rising in her throat. If Bennett Caldwell died on her riverbank, the town wouldn't see it as a tragedy. They would see it as an accusation. They would blame the girl from the swamp. Suddenly, he convulsed. Water spilled from his lips as he coughed, a violent, hacking sound that tore through the silence. He gasped, sucking in the damp air as if he were starving for it. His eyes flew open. They were gray, not the soft gray of a dove, but the turbulent, stormy gray of the river during a flood. He stared up at her, wild and unseeing. He scrambled backward in the mud, pushing himself away from her, terrified. "Easy," Lyra whispered, holding up her hands. "You're safe. You're out of the water." Bennett blinked, his chest heaving. He looked at the trees shrouded in mist, then at the dark water, and finally he focused on her. He looked at her face, illuminated by the harsh yellow light of the flashlight. "Who?" His voice was a wrecked croak, barely human. "Who are you?" "I'm Lyra," she said softly. "You washed up on my land." Bennett tried to sit up, but his arms gave way, and he slumped back into the mud. He squeezed his eyes shut, a grimace of pain twisting his features. He reached up and touched the wound on his head, his fingers coming away bloody. "Where is the camera?" he whispered. Lyra frowned, confused. "There are no cameras here. Just trees." Bennett laughed, a low, delirious sound that sent a shiver down Lyra's spine. He looked at her again, and for a second, the fog in his eyes cleared. He didn't look like a powerful man. He looked like a boy who had been running for a very long time. "Don't tell them," he gasped, gripping her wrist with a hand that was freezing cold. His grip was desperate, bruising. "Please, don't let them find me." "Don't let who find you?" Lyra asked, her pulse racing. "Your family? The police?" Bennett stared at her, his eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the river. "The noise," he murmured, his eyes rolling back as consciousness began to slip away again. "Don't let the noise in." His hand went limp, sliding from her wrist to the mud. Lyra knelt there in the mist, alone with the most famous man in the state, listening to his ragged breathing. She looked at the river, which churned silently only a few feet away. She knew she should call the sheriff. She knew she should drive to the nearest payphone. But she remembered the desperation in his grip. She remembered the look of hunted exhaustion in his eyes. She looked at the dark water. The river had brought him to her. It had spat him out at her feet like an offering or a curse. Lyra reached down and brushed the wet hair from his forehead. She made a choice then, a choice that would seal her fate as tightly as the hull of the boat she repaired. She turned off the flashlight, plunging them both back into the protective, dangerous embrace of the fog. For the next 48 hours, time inside the cabin did not move in hours or minutes. It moved in the slow, dripping rhythm of a fever breaking. Outside, the Blackwood River continued its relentless march to the sea, indifferent to the lives on its banks. But inside, the world had shrunk to the 4 timber walls, the cast-iron stove, and the narrow bed where Bennett Caldwell lay shivering under a pile of handmade quilts. Lyra moved around him like a tide, constant, quiet, and necessary. She had stripped him of his sodden wool coat, his Italian leather shoes, and the expensive suit that was now drying by the fire, stiff with river mud. In their place, he wore one of her father's old flannel shirts. It was too broad in the shoulders and smelled of sawdust and tobacco, a rough, working man's scent that seemed alien on Bennett's polished skin. He spent most of the first day drifting in and out of consciousness. He mumbled about polls, about speeches, about a woman named Eleanor. Lyra listened, but she did not judge. She wiped the sweat from his forehead with a cool rag, her touch firm and unsentimental. By the evening of the second day, the fever broke. Lyra was sitting in the rocking chair by the stove, whittling a piece of cypress wood when she felt eyes on her. She stopped the knife. Bennett was awake. He was propped up on one elbow watching her. His gray eyes were clear now, stripped of the delirium, but filled with a new kind of confusion. He looked at the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling, the jars of river clay on the shelves, and finally at her. "You stayed," he whispered. His voice was raspy and used. "I live here," Lyra replied, not looking up from her carving. "You're the guest." Bennett slowly sat up. He winced as the movement pulled at the stitches Lyra had put in his forehead. He looked down at his hands that had signed legislation and shaken the hands of presidents. They were clean, but they were shaking. "My watch," he said suddenly, patting his wrist. Panic flared in his eyes. "Where's my watch?" Lyra pointed to the bedside table. There it sat, a platinum Patek Philippe, worth more than Lyra's entire house, resting on the scarred, stained wood of a table she had built herself from salvaged driftwood. The contrast was violent, the cold, precise metal against the warm, imperfect grain. "It stopped," Lyra said softly. "Water got in. Even the expensive things drowned Bennett." Bennett reached for it, clutching the cold metal. He didn't put it on. He just held it, as if it were an anchor to a life that felt 1,000,000 miles away. "Why didn't you call the police?" he asked, looking at her with an intensity that made the small room feel airless. "There is a reward. I saw the posters before I went into the water. $50,000. Lyra set down her knife and the piece of wood. She stood up and walked over to the bed. She was wearing work boots and jeans stained with varnish. She looked nothing like the women Bennett was used to, women who smelled of hairspray and ambition. Lyra smelled of rain and cedar. "I don't need $50,000, she said, pouring a cup of water from a pitcher. She handed it to him. "And I don't like the police on my land. They trample the ferns." Bennett took the cup. His fingers brushed hers. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through the room. Bennett's skin was soft, manicured, unaccustomed to labor. Lyra's hands were rough, mapped with small scars and calluses. "We build walls of glass to keep the world out," never realizing that glass is the easiest thing to break. Bennett didn't pull his hand away. He stared at her fingers, fascinated by the texture of them. "Your hands," he murmured. "They look like they know how to fix things." "They do," Lyra said, stepping back, creating a necessary distance. "That's my job. I fix what the river breaks." "Can you fix a man?" Bennett asked. The question hung in the air, heavy and desperate. Lyra looked at him. She saw the exhaustion etched into his features, the bone-deep weariness of a man who had spent his entire life performing a role he never auditioned for. "I can patch a hull," she whispered. "But the boat has to want to float." Bennett looked away, shame coloring his cheeks. He took a sip of water, his throat working. "I didn't fall in," he confessed quietly to the dark room. "I walked in. The current, it looked so quiet. It looked like silence. I just wanted the noise to stop, Lyra. The speeches, the expectations, the constant, deafening sound of everyone telling me who I am." Lyra felt a pang in her chest. She understood the lure of the silence. She lived in it. "You're safe here," she said, her voice dropping to a murmur. "The only noise here is the wind." For a moment, the barrier between them, the class divide, the secrets, the reality of who he was dissolved. They were just two people hiding from the world in a cabin at the edge of the earth. Bennett looked at her, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to smile or charm. He just felt. "Thank you," he breathed. Suddenly, the crackle of static cut through the intimacy. It came from the old shortwave radio Lyra kept on the kitchen counter. She usually kept it on for weather reports, but now, a voice broke through the white noise. "Search continues for senatorial candidate Bennett Caldwell. Authorities are now dredging the lower Blackwood River. Family spokesperson Eleanor Vance states that foul play is suspected, citing threats from rival political factions." Bennett stiffened. The blood drained from his face. "Foul play," he whispered, horror dawning in his eyes. "They're spinning it. They're turning my suicide attempt into a martyrdom." Lyra looked at the radio, then back at Bennett. The outside world had found a way in. The noise was back, and it was rewriting his story while he sat helpless in her bed. "They aren't looking for a survivor anymore, Bennett," Lyra said, the realization chilling her to the bone. "They're looking for a body. If they find you alive, if they find you here, it destroys the narrative." Bennett looked at her, and the fear in his eyes was no longer for himself. It was for her. "You have to let me go," he said, trying to swing his legs out of bed, stumbling as his weakness caught up with him. "If they find me here, they will ruin you." Lyra stepped forward, catching him before he fell. She held him up, her body acting as the strut to his collapsing frame. "Sit down," she commanded, her voice fierce. "You can't walk, and I'm not letting you go back out there to finish what the river started." She held him, feeling the frantic beat of his heart against hers, knowing that by keeping him, she wasn't just hiding a man. She was hiding a scandal that could burn her entire quiet world to the ground. The rain returned on the fourth day. It wasn't the violent storm that had delivered Bennett to her doorstep, but a slow, gray weeping that turned the river into a sheet of hammered steel. Inside the cabin, the air had changed. The frantic urgency of survival had settled into a quiet, dangerous domesticity. Bennett was no longer the invalid in the bed. He was a presence in the room, filling the empty spaces Lyra had guarded for so long. He sat at the kitchen table, his sleeves rolled up, repairing the oscillating fan that hadn't worked in a summer. His hands, once shaking, were steady now. He moved with a focus that Lyra recognized. It was the same focus she gave to a fractured keel. Lyra stood by the stove, stirring a pot of soup, but her eyes kept drifting to him. She watched the way the firelight caught the sharp angle of his jaw, the way his hair, now clean and drying, fell over his eyes. He looked up, catching her stare. The silence that stretched between them wasn't empty. It was full of unsaid things. "It works," Bennett said softly, plugging the fan in. The blades whirred to life, a soft hum that seemed to vibrate in Lyra's chest. "You have useful hands, Bennett Caldwell," she murmured, turning back to the stove to hide the flush rising in her cheeks. Bennett stood up. He walked across the small kitchen, stopping just behind her. He didn't touch her, but Lyra could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I never knew that," he whispered, his voice close to her ear. "I spent 30 years thinking my hands were only good for shaking other hands. You gave me something real to hold." Lyra gripped the wooden spoon. The smell of cedar and rain that clung to him was overwhelming. She turned slowly. He was right there. The distance between the river and the golden sun had evaporated. Bennett reached out, his fingers grazing her cheekbone. His eyes were gray and unguarded, stripping her bare of her defenses. He leaned in, and Lyra closed her eyes, leaning into the touch, starving for it. "We build shelters out of silence, forgetting that the loudest storms are the ones that break inside our own hearts." "Lyra," he breathed. Suddenly, a low, mechanical thrum vibrated through the floorboards. Lyra's eyes flew open. She knew that sound. It wasn't the wind. It was a twin-engine outboard motor, throttled low, prowling the water. "Get down!" she hissed. She shoved Bennett toward the shadows of the hallway. He stumbled back, confusion flashing across his face, but he obeyed. Lyra grabbed her coat and stepped out onto the porch, closing the door firmly behind her. Through the mist, a sleek, black boat was cutting through the water about 50 yards out. It wasn't a fishing skiff. It bore the seal of the county sheriff, but the men standing on the deck weren't locals. They wore dark windbreakers and held binoculars. They were scanning the shoreline. They were hunting. Lyra stood perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The boat slowed. One of the men pointed toward her cabin. The spotlight swept across the porch, blinding her for a second. She didn't flinch. She raised a hand in a dull, uninterested wave, the way a local would. The man with the binoculars watched her for a terrifying 10 seconds. Then he signaled the driver. The engine roared, and the boat banked away, disappearing back into the fog. Lyra let out a breath that felt like a scream. She turned and rushed back inside. "They're gone," she said, locking the deadbolt. "But they were close, Bennett. Too close. They aren't just looking for a body anymore. They're looking for a crime scene." She turned to face him, expecting to see fear. Instead, she saw calculation. Bennett was standing by the shortwave radio. He had turned it on. The static hissed in the room, harsh and ugly. "I can't stay here," Bennett said. His voice had changed. The softness was gone. The vulnerability of the man who fixed the fan had vanished, replaced by the cool, clipped tone of the senator. "I know," Lyra said, stepping toward him. "We can move you tonight. There's a hunting blind up the creek." "No," Bennett interrupted. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the radio dial. "I mean, I can't be hidden. If they find me here, Lyra, they will arrest you. Kidnapping. Obstruction. My family. Eleanor, she will tear you apart to save my reputation." "I don't care about your family," Lyra said fiercely. "I care about keeping you alive. And I care about saving you from me," Bennett snapped. He grabbed the handset of the radio. He knew the frequency. He had likely memorized it days ago. "What are you doing?" Lyra asked, stopping cold. Bennett keyed the mic, channel 9. "This is Caldwell." "Repeat, this is Bennett Caldwell." Lyra felt as if she had been slapped. She watched as he spoke into the machine, his posture straightening, his face hardening into the mask she had seen on the billboards. "Bennett, stop," she whispered. "Get me Eleanor Vance." Bennett commanded into the static, ignoring Lyra completely. "I'm at the coordinates of the old sawmill. Send a private car. No press. No police. Just Eleanor." He released the button. The silence that followed was deafening. Lyra looked at him. The man she had saved from the mud was gone. In his place stood a politician negotiating a deal. "You called her," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. "Eleanor, the woman from your fever dreams." Bennett turned to her. His eyes were pained, but his jaw was set. "She's my campaign manager, Lyra. She's the only one who can control the narrative. If I go back on my own terms, I can keep your name out of it. I can protect you." "Protect me?" Lyra laughed, a bitter, jagged sound. "You think calling the wolves to my doorstep is protecting me? I am doing what is necessary." Bennett shouted, the pressure finally cracking his veneer. "I am trying to save your life. Do you think you can fight them? They will crush you, Lyra. I am going back to the noise, so you can keep your silence." "I didn't ask for silence," Lyra screamed back, tears hot on her face. "I asked for you. I pulled you out of the water. I dried your clothes. I gave you my bed. And you just used this place as a waiting room until you felt strong enough to put the suit back on." "That's not true," Bennett pleaded, stepping toward her. "Lyra, please." "Don't," she said, backing away, looking at him with the devastation of a woman who realizes she has fallen in love with a ghost. "You called her. You chose the world that tried to drown you." She walked to the door and threw it open to the rain. "Go to the sawmill, Bennett," she said, her voice dead. "It's a mile north. If you leave now, you won't be here when they come." Bennett stood there, torn between the woman who had saved his soul and the duty that owned his body. He looked at the radio, then at her. "I will come back," he promised. "When it's safe." "Don't lie," Lyra whispered, refusing to look at him. "Politicians always lie." Bennett took a breath, looked at her one last time, memorizing the shape of the woman he was leaving behind, and walked out into the rain, leaving the door open to the cold, wet reality of the river. The door to the cabin remained open, swinging slightly in the wind, allowing the rain to pool on the floorboards where Bennett had stood only moments ago. The silence he left behind was not the peaceful quiet of the river. It was a vacuum, a violent absence that sucked the air out of the room. Lyra stared at the radio, which sat silent on the counter. She looked at the empty chair. She looked at the uncarved wood. She realized then that letting him go wasn't an act of mercy. It was an act of surrender. She was letting the river take him back, not the water this time, but the current of a life that was drowning him just as surely. "No," she whispered to the empty room. She grabbed her heavy coat and the iron flashlight. She didn't lock the door. She ran. She ran into the dark, following the muddy track that led north to the old sawmill. The rain slashed at her face, blinding and cold, but she knew this path by the soles of her feet. She knew every root, every slick patch of clay. She ran because for the first time in 10 years, she wasn't content to watch the wreckage drift by. She was going to catch it. The sawmill was a skeletal ruin of rusted iron and rotting timber, looming out of the fog like the ribs of a prehistoric beast. As Lyra broke through the tree line, she saw the lights. Twin beams of halogen, white cut through the mist, illuminating the falling rain like shards of glass. A black town car idled next to the collapsed loading dock. The engine purred with a sinister, quiet efficiency. Bennett was standing in the glare of the headlights. He looked small against the machine. A woman was standing in front of him. She held a large black umbrella, shielding herself from the downpour, while Bennett stood exposed, the water soaking through Lyra's father's flannel shirt. Eleanor. She was exactly as Lyra had imagined, sharp, tailored, and terrifyingly composed. She didn't look like a woman who had been worried about a missing man. She looked like a mechanic assessing a damaged asset. Lyra slowed, staying in the shadows of the cypress trees, close enough to hear their voices over the drumming of the rain. "The statement is already drafted," Eleanor was saying, her voice crisp cutting through the storm. "You slipped while hiking the ridge. You fell into the current. You were disoriented. A local fisherman found you and brought you to safety. It's a survival story, Bennett. The voters love a survivor. It makes you look resilient." "I didn't slip, Eleanor," Bennett said. His voice was low, heavy with exhaustion. "It doesn't matter what you did," Eleanor snapped, stepping closer, though she was careful not to let the mud touch her heels. "It matters what we tell them. The Senate seat is within 5 points. If you come back as a suicidal depressive, you lose. If you come back as a man who conquered the river, you win." "I don't want to win," Bennett shouted, the sound raw and tearing. "I wanted to stop. I told you a week ago I wanted to withdraw. You told me I couldn't. You told me the legacy was bigger than the man." "It is," Eleanor replied coldly. "Your father built this machine, Bennett. You don't get to turn it off just because you're tired." Lyra stepped out of the shadows. "He isn't a machine," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of the earth itself. Eleanor spun around, the umbrella tilting. She looked at Lyra, at the wet hair, the mud-stained boots, the fierce, unyielding eyes of the river witch. "And this," Eleanor said, looking back at Bennett with disdain, "must be the fisherman. I assume she has been paid for her silence." "Don't speak to her," Bennett warned, stepping between the two women. "She saved my life, Eleanor. While you were drafting press releases, she was pulling the water out of my lungs." "And we are grateful," Eleanor said dismissively, reaching into her coat pocket and pulling out a checkbook. "How much, my dear? To forget you ever saw him? To forget he was wearing flannel and crying in your kitchen?" Lyra looked at the checkbook. Then she looked at Bennett. He was looking at her with a desperate, terrified hope. He was waiting to see if she would take it. He was waiting to see if everyone in his life could be bought. "I don't want your money," Lyra said, walking past Eleanor straight to Bennett. She stopped inches from him, ignoring the rain, ignoring the car, ignoring the inevitable pull of his future. "I want the truth," Lyra whispered to him. "Why did you really go into the water, Bennett? It wasn't just the noise. You know the river. You know what it does." Bennett looked down at her. The rain dripped from his eyelashes, mingling with the tears he had been holding back for days. "Because I knew the truth would destroy the family," Bennett confessed, his voice breaking. "My father, the legacy Eleanor talks about, it was built on bribes. It was built on ruin. I found the ledgers 3 days ago. I was going to go to the press. Eleanor told me if I did, she would destroy everyone I cared about." He looked at Eleanor, then back at Lyra. "I walked into the river because I was a coward, Lyra. I couldn't fight them, and I couldn't join them, so I tried to erase myself. We build walls of glass to keep the world out, never realizing that glass is the easiest thing to break. Lyra reached out and took his hand. It was cold, freezing cold. You're not a coward, she said firmly. You just didn't have anyone to stand with you. Eleanor opened the back door of the town car. The interior light glowed warm and inviting, leather seats, dry air, safety. Get in the car, Bennett, Eleanor commanded. Playtime is over. If you stay here with the swamp girl, the story changes. I will leak the mental health records. I will destroy your father's name, and I will make sure the world knows she kidnapped you. You will both be buried. It was a choice between two lives. The warm, suffocating prison of the Senate, or the cold, dangerous freedom of the riverbank. Bennett looked at the open car door. Then he looked at Lyra's hand holding his. He looked at the woman who had stitched his head and fed him soup and sat in the dark with him while he shook. He took a step, but not toward the car. He stepped back, pulling Lyra with him, moving away from the halogen glare and into the rain. Go, Eleanor, Bennett said. His voice was quiet, but it had the terrifying calm of deep water. Excuse me. Eleanor blinked, the rain finally hitting her face as she stepped out from the umbrella in shock. I said go, Bennett repeated. Release the mental health records. Release the ledgers. Burn the legacy down. I don't care anymore. He squeezed Lyra's hand, anchoring himself to the only real thing in the storm. I'm not coming back to the noise, he said. I'm staying in the quiet. Eleanor stared at him, her mouth opening and closing. For the first time in her career, she had no spin. She slammed the car door shut. You will regret this by morning, she spat. Maybe, Bennett said, looking at Lyra, a faint, weary smile touching his lips. But tonight, for the first time in my life, I'm actually breathing. Eleanor got into the car. The engine revved, tires spinning in the mud before finding traction. The black vehicle tore away, taillights disappearing into the fog, leaving Bennett and Lyra standing alone in the ruins of a sawmill, soaked to the bone, shivering, but standing on solid ground. The taillights of Eleanor's car were swallowed by the fog, leaving Bennett and Lyra standing in the skeletal ruin of the sawmill. The rain had softened, turning into a fine, misting drizzle that clung to their skin like a second baptism. They didn't speak immediately. The silence that followed Eleanor's departure was profound. It was the silence of a bomb that had failed to detonate, or perhaps a bomb that had gone off so far away that the shockwave hadn't reached them yet. Bennett let go of Lyra's hand, but only to wrap his arm around her shoulders, pulling her into the warmth of his side. He was shivering, his expensive shoes ruined in the muck, his inheritance discarded in the mud, but he looked solid. She will do it, Bennett said, his voice raspy, staring into the dark where his old life had vanished. By morning, the papers will say I'm unstable. By noon, they will say I'm a traitor to the party. By dinner, the Caldwell name will be ash. Lyra looked up at him. She reached up and wiped a streak of rain from his cheek. Let it burn, she whispered. Ash is good for the soil. It makes things grow. They walked back to the cabin in the dark. They didn't run this time. They walked with the slow, deliberate pace of two people who had nowhere else to be. When they stepped inside, Lyra locked the door. It wasn't to keep the world out anymore. It was to keep the peace in. Narrator. The storm Eleanor promised did come, but it raged on the other side of the river. For the next 3 months, the radio, which Bennett refused to turn off, crackled with the debris of his former life. The Caldwell collapse was the headline of the decade. The mental health records were leaked. The ledgers were exposed, triggering federal investigations into his father's estate. The dynasty that had ruled the state for 50 years crumbled under the weight of its own corruption, just as Bennett had predicted. But in the floodplain, the news was just noise. It was a distant thunder that couldn't shake the timber walls of the cabin. Bennett didn't hide under the quilts anymore. He learned to chop wood. He learned to distinguish the call of a barred owl from a screech owl. He grew a beard, hiding the face of the golden sun beneath a mask of rough, dark hair. He stopped looking at his hands as if they were useless. One late afternoon in April, the sun broke through the canopy, dappling the river in gold. Real gold, not the political kind. Lyra was down at the dock, varnishing the hull of a skiff. The smell of the chemicals was sharp and clean. She worked with her usual rhythm, stroke, dip, stroke. She felt a shadow fall over her. Bennett was standing on the end of the dock. He held 2 bottles of cold beer. He looked different. The hollow, haunted look was gone, replaced by a quiet weathering. He looked like a man who had made peace with his ghosts. He sat down on the edge of the dock, letting his boots dangle over the water. He handed a bottle to Lyra. "The investigation closed today," he said quietly, watching a dragonfly hover over the reeds. "They seized the estate. The house on the hill is gone. The accounts are frozen. I am, officially, a man with nothing." Lyra took the beer. She sat beside him, their shoulders touching. She looked at the river, which flowed on, indifferent to bank accounts and senators. "You have a roof," Lyra listed, ticking off on her fingers. "You have a job. I saw you fix that transom yesterday, and it wasn't terrible. And you have a beer." Bennett chuckled. It was a low, warm sound that vibrated against her arm. "And I have the fisherman," he added, turning his head to look at her. Lyra smiled, but her eyes remained on the dark water. The current swirled around the pilings, deep and mysterious. "You know," she murmured, "when I pulled you out, I thought I was saving a drowning man. But I think the river just gave you back because it knew you weren't finished yet." Bennett looked at the water. He remembered the cold. He remembered the desire to sink, to let the silence fill his lungs. "I thought the truth would kill me," he admitted. "I thought if I let go of the lie, I would disappear. But I'm still here." "You are," Lyra said. She reached over and covered his hand with hers. Her palm was rough. His was becoming calloused. They fit together like a dovetail joint. Bennett turned his hand over and interlaced his fingers with hers. He squeezed tight. "We try to bury the truth in deep water," he whispered, reciting the lesson the river had taught them both, forgetting that the river eventually brings everything back to the surface. "It brought you back," Lyra said softly. "It brought me to you," Bennett corrected. He leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't the desperate kiss of a survivor, nor the stolen kiss of a secret lover. It was the steady, enduring kiss of a partner. It tasted of the sun on the water and the freedom of having nothing left to lose. As the sun set, turning the Blackwood River into a ribbon of fire, the rest of the world continued to spin, loud and chaotic and demanding. But on the weathered dock, amidst the cypress knees and the rising mist, 2 people sat in the beautiful, heavy silence of the truth. They had lost the kingdom, but they had found the shore. And as Lyra rested her head on his shoulder, listening to the steady, unhurried beat of his heart, she knew that this was the only election that had ever mattered. He was the man she saved from the river, but in the end, he was the one who taught her that love isn't about holding your breath to survive. It's about finally, truly exhaling.